So exciting to be with all of you here today. My name is Tatiana Kolovu, and I wanted to open the screen of my amazing guest, Steve Martin, today because there's so much we want to talk about and so much we have to share. Steve, you're coming in from?
I'm here in London, and it's lovely to speak to you, Tatiana.
Wonderful. I am in Bloomington, Indiana, in the southern part of the state in the US, and we have really good sunshine today. How is your weather? Is that a sore subject to discuss?
Actually, today it's been pretty good. Actually, traditionally here in London and England, we're known for the drizzle, for the rain, for the fog. But I'm looking out at the moment; it's still pretty sunny, so
Wonderful.
going to be pretty happy about that.
Well, thanks all of you. Tamara and Olivier and Celio are already in. Tell us where you're coming in from because we are in both sides of the pond, as we say. We love to know where you're coming in from. And as you're doing that, I want to tell you a little bit of a story of how we came about to be discussing this topic with Steve. The Stronger newsletter that I produce in April had the topic of using techniques for influence and for persuasion for presentations. I teach business presentations and I wanted to focus on that. So I started looking, and one of the books that I studied in graduate school were Dr. Cialdini's and Steve Martin's book called The 50 Ways of the 50 Secrets from the Science of Persuasion. And as I looked at those, I thought of my MBA students doing presentations overseas. And Steve, you have discussed all of these. I'll talk about your LinkedIn Learning course just now that you are sharing. We talk about the concept of reciprocity, right?
Yeah.
So the audience is going to get something out of it, and the speaker should share it. The audience of scarcity, Steve, which is?
Essentially, people want more of those things they can have less of. And so sometimes we present all the benefits of our case, but sometimes it can be a pretty impactful thing to do to point out what an audience may lose if they perhaps
Don't take
don't
it.
move in your
Love it.
direction.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
The topic of authority, which if you are maybe not the top authority, like some of the speakers that you have at Columbia Business School, and we have at the Kelly School, but maybe leaning on what authority figures say in your evidence that you share. We talk about consistency being a really important part of persuasion and of influence that you deliver on a consistent basis.
Yeah.
But the two concepts that really stood out to me were liking and consensus, because when it really comes down to it, when you're trying to influence and persuade, you better put yourself out there and have the backing of others, right, Steve?
Exactly right. And here's something straight away that I can see people joining from all over the world:
Isn't
Venezuela,
it amazing?
Canada. Actually, I've just seen someone joining from Tempe. I used to live in Tempe when I was in Arizona, so that's a
Yep.
fun place to stay
Pakistan.
at.
Yes.
Indeed. But one of the things about the liking principle I think is really interesting to me is that we think that the first rule of influence is to essentially find ways in which our audience can like us, connect to us in some way. And that absolutely is important. But there's something that's even more persuasive, even more important. And that's to find things you like about your audience.
Ah. Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Yes, we might want to say yes to someone because maybe we like them, but we're more likely to be engaged and connected to someone who we know likes us, because people who like us would typically have our best interests at
Yep.
heart. And so I think
Yep.
that's an interesting little quirk and interpretation, but a really important one.
You know, when I coach my students to speak in another country and they're speaking about projects they're persuading, I always say to them, make a mention of an ancient ruin that we went to that you enjoyed, or something in the food that you like. You're creating a little small talk, but warming up to your audience on their territory and talking about something that will create a connection. I'm
Absolutely.
seeing people from India to Tanzania, Honduras, Pakistan. This is so amazing, and soon my Greek friends are going to start chiming in. My country people, they always come in from Greece as well, and I love it. But before we go on into our great amazing topic today, I want to tell you that we have a rock star guest on our show. And I'm very thankful, Steve, because I literally knocked on your virtual door and you said yes. I was writing about persuasion. I did a cold call, saw Steve's course on LinkedIn and said, I have to have more of a conversation. Steve is a behavioral scientist and he has been nominated as an author by the Royal Society in England. Really big deal. And as I mentioned, the book that he wrote with Dr. Cialdini, the 50 Secrets to from the Science of Persuasion. But today we'll talk a little more about this fantastic book called Messengers, the 8 Ways to be Heard, and something that I already learned from the very first conversation with Steve, something that's really important that we're saving for you too. Steve authors articles anywhere from the New York Times to the Washington Post, Financial Times, Harvard Business Review. He's been on the BBC TV and radio. He's a visiting professor at Columbia University, and he is in charge of a lot of the programs of executive education and does work with the MBA programs. I probably have missed 10 things of the things that you do, Steve, but I know that for this moment, you're here with us, and I'm very grateful. And thank you for saying yes to me without even knowing me. I appreciate it tremendously.
Well, I'm pleased to. It's clearly a testament to your own influence and persuasion skills, Tatiana. I'm very, very happy to be here. Very happy to join you and your guests online. Thank you so much for the kind invitation.
So guests online, you have a responsibility to now start engaging with us and asking us questions. We've chunked our conversation into 3 parts. And the very first part I wanted to focus on was how important, as you heard me, I made an effort to introduce Steve in a way that builds his credibility if you don't know who he is. So in some way, maybe if you know me, I've chosen to work with Steve, you trust Steve, you like Steve, but you also get Steve's rock star introductions, which quite often as speakers, we don't take the time to write a good introduction and give it to the people introducing us. But maybe you're not doing a keynote. Steve said to me, when I said, what's the most important part for the person to gain credibility as a messenger? Steve, you said,
find ways in which you can build a platform where your expertise is introduced to your audience before you start to speak. Mm-hmm. I think, one of the things that you, Tatiana, will know from the teachings that you undertake at the Kelley Business School, and I suspect that everyone on the call today will recognize, is that we live in a world where we are overwhelmed with messages, overwhelmed with people wanting to tell us about their product, their proposition, make their case to us. It's a kind of tsunami of data and information that we are faced with every single day. And one of the observations that myself and one of my colleagues, Dr. Joseph Marks, who undertook the Messengers research with me, one of the broader and kind of more common observations that we found was that increasingly in this information overloaded world, we seem to be paying less attention to what is being said, mm-hmm. and instead focus more attention on who is saying mm-hmm. what is being said. And the implication for that is that the messenger has become the message. We don't have to then think about the content, weigh up the pros and cons of a case or a proposition or a presentation or an idea. We just simply need to look at the messenger and say, yeah, I think I can trust him or her, or they sound like they know what they're talking about, or they're charismatic, or they have one of these traits.
Yes.
And I can make a quick and easy judgment about whether I should listen to them or not. And that is where we're at today. So for anyone that's thinking about presenting a message, designing a proposal, a presentation, I think we spend a lot of time putting our PowerPoint presentations together, our graphs, our slides, our cases, our messages, and that's vitally important still. I'm not saying that that's unimportant. But my observation is that we seem to spend less time thinking about how I'm going to be introduced before I deliver those messages. Yeah. It's becoming more and more crucial, I would say, that we do that.
And when you and I started talking about this, you were talking about young first year or second year PhD students who were sitting in a room with decision makers and were about to present data. And before they did, male or female, whoever it was, but maybe they were in their 20s, right? You were
Yeah.
telling me, you made a point that the person sitting at the board table said, before I tell you even more, I want to introduce rock star,
Yeah.
associate professor or researcher or data analyst, and going on. And you find in your data that those introductions yield yes decisions because the
Yeah.
person doesn't have to prove themselves.
Exactly right. And so two things here. So first of all, if you're in a situation where you're relatively young or you're in the early stages of your career, you're invited into these meetings.
Yeah.
You sit down in these rooms where there's 12, 15 people kind of around a boardroom, whatever. Already we're making judgments about people. Oh, these young people in the room, what are they doing here? Are they here to take the notes? Are they here to bring the breakfast? Are they here? And what you described there, Tatiana, is exactly what happened to me. I have a relatively young team. They are all incredibly smart. They've all got graduate degrees, doctorate degrees, incredibly smart people, smarter than I am. But when they're sitting in the room and they're, relatively young, and particularly if they are presenting to an older audience, people might be making all sorts of judgments about them. And they're the wrong judgments because these people will often be the smartest people in the room. They can't sit in a room and say, hey, you need to listen to me because I've got a PhD in this, or I've got 5 years experience in this, or I've done this or done that. So what happens is typically someone will say, well, let's go around the room and introduce ourselves. And we all hate that because we're thinking, well, what am I going to say about myself? I can't really, toot my own horn in public, particularly with a group of strangers. So most people just go around the room and give about as much information that can be reliably conveyed on a business card. Hi, I'm Steve from the IT department.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, so that's not helpful. And actually, the bottom line also is, let's face it, no one's listening anyway, because everyone's thinking, oh my God, what am I going to say?
What am I going to say? Yeah.
So here's the point I want to make. So if you're relatively young in your career, a strong piece of advice is to ask your manager, your supervisor, your leader, the people that will be introducing you, give them something notable to say about you in the moment of those introductions.
In that context.
That's the first thing. Here's the other thing. If you're a leader of people, if you're a manager of people, okay, introducing your teams, your staff, your colleagues in this way does two things. The first thing it does is it gives those people labels to live up to. We can talk maybe in a few moments about some studies in health where the way in which healthcare professionals are introduced before they give advice to a patient not only ensures that message that they give is more likely to land persuasively and memorably, but because they've been introduced as credible experts that know their staff, that have got experience, when you give people those labels in your organization, you are giving them aspirations to live up to. And we find that they are more likely to live up to those aspirations. They go off sick lists. They are more likely to, perform well, these kind of things. And confidence and satisfaction in their services go up as well. So there are upsides for everyone concerned if we do this thoughtfully and elegantly.
And I want to focus on who has the control. You're talking about the younger scientist who may walk in the room and doesn't have someone to introduce them. I'd say it's your responsibility to find an ally, to find a sponsor, to find someone that will help this whole process go easier. And as you said, it's the responsibility of the leader to make that introduction of the junior scientist, and also to not be the one to say, everyone go around the room introducing themselves. That person gives credibility to why is everyone sitting at the table. And I see some of the comments, and folks, this changes per meeting. So I want to focus a little bit on messengers, as we say. And Clark is asking a question that has to do with virtual meetings. In today's world, we're all in the virtual world. And how do you go about loving your audience? Since I have the advantage of reading this first, I'll let Steve ponder this for a minute. Clark, I would just say, study your audience really, really well. Know who was in the meeting beforehand, what was approved, what do they like, What's the story? Is there any backstory? Doing and studying your audience allows you to connect and find out what is it going to, what's the connecting point going to be. And you don't even have to be in the same room with them, but you have to show that interest specifically. Steve, do you have any specific tips on how do you love your audience when we are in a virtual setting?
Well, I actually do. There's two or three that immediately come to mind, because what the pandemic did is it gave us an opportunity to test and study some of these communication ideas and strategies when you are behind a screen rather than perhaps next to someone in a conference room or in a coffee house. And here's a couple of things that we actually find can be quite important. So if you're on Teams or Zoom or any other kind of virtual connection tool, it can be helpful to pay careful attention to the banner that contains your name. So don't just put Steve or, Steve Martin or whatever the case may be. If you have legitimate qualifications, perhaps you work in financial services and you have a qualification, perhaps you're a medic, a doctor. These cues of expertise, of credibility, can carry sway. And of course, it's being delivered by proxy because it's a banner under your name.
Mhm.
It's not, hey, before I say what I've got to say to you today, make sure you pay attention to me because I've got a PhD in this or I've got experience in that. So that's one thing that we can do to kind of essentially communicate our expertise, our credibility beforehand. You may even want to think about what you do before the meeting even takes place.
Mhm.
I know for some of you in the room, you might be in a sales or a marketing or a consulting context, and you may be in a one-to-one meeting where you don't have someone to introduce you, but some email that you send in advance, to set up the meeting. Perhaps you can include a 2-line biography, some of the major attributes that you have that make you worth listening to. That could be adequately conveyed in perhaps an email or a short agenda. So there's ways in which we can actually convey our expertise, our authority. In terms of this loving your audience, liking your audience, two things immediately come to mind. So there was a study that was actually done during the pandemic that suggested that anything we can do to humanize what is essentially a bloodless transaction, we are pixels behind a screen, can be helpful. And here are two recommendations that came out of these studies. The first is, before you get down to any official business, look for some way in which you can provide something to the individual or your audience that connects you in some way. For example, in a series of studies that they ran with salespeople who were selling via virtual platforms, they gave salespeople cartoons. These were Dilbert cartoons, in fact, Scott Adams, cartoonist, of negotiations that had gone disastrously wrong, but were kind of funny. And they went along with a message, looking forward to seeing you on our call next week. Let's just hope that we don't have a scenario like Dilbert has had here and these kind of things. And they rated two things. They rated the likability of that sender, okay, and the perceived trustworthiness.
I love it.
And both of them rose considerably compared to a control where that cartoon wasn't sent, but the same person took the meeting. So there's a way in which we can immediately think about humanizing our message. You mentioned in the introduction, Tatiana, my long-term colleague and co-author Robert Cialdini, the great guru of social influence.
Yes.
And he's very often asked, what is the one thing that I can do that would make me more persuasive, more influential, more impactful? Just give me one thing. I don't have time for 3 things, 10 things, 20 things. Give me one thing. And his response: be more human. And
authenticity, right there.
That can be difficult, but there are ways in which we can actually do it. And there are 3 or 4 that immediately spring to mind.
Back to having someone introduce you in the world of networking. For sure, if I couldn't get to you, but I knew someone who knows you, I really connected with your administrative assistant, Catherine. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So if Catherine said to you, Tatiana is really amazing. She's trying to get a hold of you. I've spent some time with her. Do you want to take her call? If there's someone you trust that tells you about me, I am more likely to get into your circle. And all of us have the opportunity to have those people in our lives. This is why working networks without expecting something is so important. You never know who is going to be able to help you in the long run. And it comes back to this reciprocity and likability piece too.
It does. There's a really interesting thing actually to pick up on about this reciprocity, and I think it's something that we sometimes forget. Now, it comes with a caveat. It needs to be done gracefully, elegantly, and respectfully.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea that people give back to others the form of behavior that has been given to them first, that's the essential core of the principle of reciprocity. And what's going on there is essentially exchanges of obligation.
Mm-hmm.
I've done something for you. I've invited you to our house this weekend for a barbecue. You are now obligated to invite me to one of your parties the next time you have one. I remember your birthday, you remember my birthday. I do you a favor, you do me a favor.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it works.
Yeah.
But in the business context, we often forget that. And, many people, and I'm sure there's hundreds on the call today that will be more than happy to help people, service them, provide help and assistance to customers, to colleagues, these kind of things. And they know they've been successful because they hear a response from the person they've helped. And that response is typically, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you say after someone genuinely says thank you to you? Typically, we say things like, don't worry about it. It's all part of the service.
No worries. Yeah.
No worries. No worries.
Mm-hmm.
That's a mistake.
Yeah.
That's a mistake. That is a moment of influence you've been afforded and you've earned. Now, here's the graceful, elegant, responsible use. Okay. I'm not suggesting that the moment someone says thank you to you, you turn around and go, right, I'm going to write that obligation down. You owe me now.
You
and I'm
owe
going
me.
to remember. Yeah, it's not that. But those are the moments where I'm happy to help. Maybe at some point in the future, you might know someone in your network that might be interested in speaking to me. We could connect some people. Those are network opportunities, those exchange moments as well. And I think, that's, if you wanted to be more persuasive, be more human, of course. But the other thing is that just count up over the course of a week or a month, how many times people actually say thank you to you. You'd be surprised at how many opportunities you already are creating for yourself.
I mistakenly put up this comment. This is being recorded, so it's made available. But Ramya early on asked this question, and it goes beyond presentation, Steve. How should we make people like us in conversation? And Ramya, Steve just said, be yourself, be authentic, be human. At times, we may have a conversation about, the weather or something that happened that day, or making it human, and that takes away that pressure of, oh my goodness, it's the well-renowned author and LinkedIn instructor, whatever it may be. Stay on the human level, would you say, Steve?
I think so. I mean, one of the things that you communicated both to me and to Catherine in your message, and it came through really quite clearly, was we have something that is central to what we do that we both have in common. Okay. We both teach at business schools.
Yep.
Okay. You at Kelly, me at Columbia. We both have an interest in both the research and the application of communication and persuasive communication.
Sure.
And here's something that I think we all intuitively recognize. As humans, we are hardwired for difference. And there's lots of good reasons for that. When we see something different, we can immediately put ourselves on guard. It could be a foe, not a friend. It could be a risk to us. And so we look out for difference. So when people come to us with similarities, with commonalities, those are the conditions that typically activate these exchanges. So yeah, in any conversation, the first question you should, here's the question you should not be asking yourself to start, which is, how do I persuade this person? How do I get to like this person? How do I get them to listen to me?
Yeah.
Don't ask those questions first. They can come later. The questions we want to be asking ourselves are, what do I have? What do we genuinely have in common with this individual or this group? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, how do I show that I have respect and liking for them?
Mm-hmm.
There's your reciprocity, because if I give that, then maybe it comes back to me.
Yeah. But that's the basics of building rapport, finding what we have in common. And when someone asks, how do I make people like me? I say, collect data, collect information, ask open-ended questions that gives you a little bit of a hint of what the other person does or likes or has experiences. We two connected on, you were doing the executive education program. Like, they let you out of the room. Good luck. They're going to call you back soon, because I know what that's like. And we started talking about that before anything else. We have one more learner who says how to keep engaging and attentive while the presentation is going on. I'm assuming you mean this from you are the presenter, and I've done several other lives on engagement, but do you have any thoughts on or research, Steve, on likability, or while someone is managing a meeting or presenting, are people still deciding if they like them or how they respond to something that may be difficult? Do they decide if they like them still? Or this whole level of engagement and attentiveness, how does that connect with the likability piece?
Well, there's two things here. There is about that element of likability, and two things come to mind. So in the first scenario, let's think about a scenario where you're only presenting once. This is your first shot, and you've done those introductions. You have been kind of introduced to the group in a way that conveys and builds a platform for your expertise. Your job now is to tell your story, to make your presentation, and to land your points, but to do so in a way that keeps the audience's attention in that next 6, 10, 18, 25 minutes, whatever the case may be. Okay.
Sure.
The single most effective thing that I've actually seen is to present your presentation in the context of a mystery that needs to be solved. You present your initial idea. It could be a question. It could be a short story that betrays people's expectation. Oh, I thought you were going to say this, and suddenly you said this. And then throughout the course of your presentation, you present your data, your information, your key points as a way of starting to answer and provide a rationale for that mystery or that question. And that's what you present last. You get that closure. They teach this in improvisation classes. They teach this in storytelling, in script writing, these kind of things, is that initial hook. So for one-offs, that would be my go-to. But also, we're in situations sometimes where we are engaging with audiences over time. We may have an initial meeting, then we need to progress to the next stage. Think about if we're trying to get funding for an idea, or we're trying to bring on board a group and join a project that's undergoing. Not everyone needs to be at every part of the process. These kind of things where there's going to be multiple interactions. And here there's some other research that I actually find fascinating. And it's this context, it's this concept of progress. One of the things that we've noticed, there's good research to actually support this, that people are much more likely to jump on board an idea or a project that has already started than one that we're all here and we're going to start from scratch, a blank sheet of paper. So it can be helpful in those instances when you're starting a meeting to actually say, well, I'm really pleased to be here today. And the good news is we're already 20% of the way into working on this program, this project, this funding, this research, whatever the case may be. So the purpose of our meeting today is to get us from that 20% to that 30%. People jump on board progress more than they do a new idea, because a new idea is kind of something else that I've got to now do. So there's a couple of ideas that immediately come to mind, whether it's a one-off meeting or a series of meetings. Think about mysteries, think about progress.
Or you can say we field tested this and we want to progress. So we did some questioning to test our hypothesis too.
I think
I
that's smart. Yeah.
I'd like to shift from this entire time. We talk about that likability and that consensus around the messenger. And as you said, in our days, and we had a long conversation when we met before about how influencers now are acting in social media, and we believe the person, and because of we believe the person, whatever they say, we believe as well, which can be problematic. Let's transition now into what the person is saying and how we can help our learners be effective with that messaging. And Lalit's point comes in with a question is, give me some tips of presenting something with experts. And this is sort of a bridging, Lalit, thank you for helping us transition to that. I'm assuming you're in a room and you are that young scientist where other people have been living this problem or this context for a long time. They are the experts. My advice to you would be not to come in and say, well, I know kind of what you do, and here's how it's going to be better. I would address the fact to say, you have all of these years of experience. So pay respect to that level of authority and then bring your information on how that will help them make better decision. Make it a lot about them and less about you. So there's not a judgment there for someone to say, you could be my son, I'm not going to listen to you, because that does happen immediately, doesn't it, Steve?
It really does. I think you're exactly right about that, Tatiana. There's this brilliant research from Zach Tamala. He was a PhD at ASU. He's now at Stanford Business School. And he looked at research to answer this exact question that Lalit is asking here. Is that you find yourself in a situation where you've got a group of people in the room that are more experienced than you. They might be experts in a particular domain. They might just have professional years of experience. And you're the junior. What do you do in those situations? And it turns out there are two things you do. And one is one that you've just alerted people to, Tatiana. This is this humility, the point that you respect the expertise, the experience in the room. Okay. The second, though, is a little surprising, actually. And it's you frame the new information that you are about to present as potential. In these studies, Zach and his team, what they actually found was that when compared to an expert, a newer communicator, someone that perhaps didn't have that knowledge, that experience, when they were framed as a potential new source of helpful information, people leaned into that more than the reality of the situation that was actually sitting in the room. So in even those situations, and I recognize early in our career, sometimes we aren't the expert in the room. We aren't the person with the most credibility. There's a potential for you to frame it in that way. So that humility and presenting or framing what you're about to present as potential can be pretty compelling to people.
Now, I want to pause here for a minute because we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the hard and soft part of a messenger as you describe it in your book. But you talked about humility, and I know that in the messenger's book, there's an entire chapter on power and how someone may come across as being more powerful than humble. What's the juxtaposition there? And are you in a place where you are junior, you're going to come in more humble than versus you're the expert, you're going to come in more powerful? How do you advise around that for the messengers? I know I jumped back to that, but what you said was critical for our learners.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. Yeah, so briefly, for everyone listening, we find in the research there are two types of messengers. There are hard
All
messengers,
in this book.
and there are soft messengers. Thank you. The
Yes.
hard messengers are largely defined as they get their message heard because they are seen by their audience of possessing some sort of status over their audience.
Status, yes.
They're rich and famous. They're experts. They are maybe physically attractive, or in the case that you're talking about here, Tatiana, they are dominant. They have a dispositionally dominant character. And that's fine in some circumstances. And there are research that would suggest that those are particularly useful traits when your audience is uncertain, particularly uncertain or anxious.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the contrast to that is that we don't always listen to experts. We don't always listen to, the powerful politician, the tallest, most attractive person in the rooms. Often we do, but often we listen to the soft messenger, and the soft messenger is characterized by the fact that they have a connectedness with their audience. They're seen as warm
Mm-hmm.
or vulnerable in some instances. That humility
Yep.
exudes vulnerability. They're seen as trustworthy, or they're seen as charismatic. And depending on the context, you would want to kind of adapt as best you can and as authentically as you can to those kind of scenarios. I'll give you one brief example we find in the research that organizations, for example, that are in a bit of a spin, perhaps their strategy has gone a little bit, kind of down the wrong road. There are low levels of psychological safety, stock prices perhaps plummeting. In those situations, the executive boards of those organizations are much, much more likely to recruit hard messengers into the.
I could guess that.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yes.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
When things are rosy, when things are going well, when there's a clear direction and strategy, when the stock price is doing well, there's high levels of psychological safety. Those same executive recruitment boards, much, much more likely to take on executives that have those more connected characteristics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it turns out, I think, that I think you have this. There's a link that anyone that's interested
Sure.
can go to, and they can actually assess their messenger profile, what their primary and secondary preferences are, and get a sense of what type of messenger they are and how they might need to adapt accordingly to their audiences.
And their situations and their context,
Absolutely.
right? We talk, and in the book, you talk a lot about politicians and CEOs and in your regular ongoing team. And for all of us, I'm more on the soft messenger side, but I know that when the going gets tough and we have to make a decision, I have to flex my style as I go.
Yeah.
We have Nanjima asks a question about how do you engage teams that have zero interest on the topic? What happens when your message is flat, or when your message is not something they're interested in? You talk about unveiling the story and making it intriguing, and maybe the way that you deliver, the tone, the open-ended questions, your passion about what something is. What suggestions do you have on these apathetic audiences that I find very difficult?
I find them difficult too. And so, I mean, here's one thing that I have to say that is just honest and is a fact that everyone, I'm sure, that's listening in today, either live or in the recording, will be able to kind of connect with, which is, if you've got a topic that's boring, it's boring, okay? It's pretty tough to make it shiny, make it sparkle. So it may actually be that you may need to think about the fact that, I've got some dull messages to present here, and I might just need to think about the timing in which I do that. Is there something else that I can be offering here that is perhaps a little bit more energizing, engaging? Or can I kind of turn this boring subject, or, something that's perhaps people think that I know all of this, I've heard it all before, I'm not real interested in it. Is there a quirk? Back to that mystery thing. Is there something here that is kind of, pertinent to the audience? I'll give an example, if I may. So this is a few years ago. We were working with a company that had a team of salespeople. They had hundreds of salespeople. And these salespeople would go on induction programs when they joined the company. And one of the things that they actually had to do as part of their induction, because they were given a company car, a company vehicle, they basically had to sit in a room for an hour and a half, and they were taught classroom style how to fill out their gas expenses, what to do in the case of an accident, all these kind of administrative burdensome stuff that no one really, really cares about. Because what people really cared about was, what car am I going to get at the end of it? Just give me the keys. Just give me the keys.
Yeah.
Really boring. Okay. Here's what the fleet manager did, which I thought was amazing. Okay. So the first thing she did, she came in and she said, you're all sitting there and you're going to think this is boring. Okay. And from a certain perspective, it is. You know, we could do this the fun way, we could do this the boring way. I'm going to do it the fun way. And here's how I'm going to do it. Okay. I'm going to show you how to fill out your expenses, your gas form, your insurance firms, and these kind of things. But before I do that, I've been doing this job for 15 years. People leave the company. And when they leave the company, they need to bring their car back. Can you imagine some of the things that me and my team find in people's cars on their last day of the business when they hand it back? Oh my God.
What did she say?
Someone brought their car back with a fridge in it. Others, there are empty beer bottles. How about this? A sex toy we once found in a car. We found all these crazy things, and everyone's now leaning in.
Suspense. Yeah.
What else is she going to say? And what she did, which was brilliant, was she said, I'm going to tell you one or two things that we find, but after each one, I'm just going to refer your attention to this form, and here's what you need to do with it. Here's the next one. They're waiting for the next one. It's almost like
so they can hear the docket.
The treat at the end of learning how to, the boring bit was, give me another snippet, give me another thing. This is hilarious. This is funny.
I love it.
And I thought that was just an absolute masterclass in being able to hold an audience's attention for close to 90 minutes for something that was a boring administrative task, like filling out your gas and your petrol and your expenses forms.
Absolutely. Oh, I love it. I love it. We talked a little bit about, before we transition to our last topic, we talked about when the message is a message that either is going to a tough audience, the audience is resistant, they're going to say no, you are possibly pitching an idea and the person before you is pitching it at a lower price. And you talked about the introduction and the concept of inoculation.
Yeah.
When it comes to messaging, can you touch upon inoculation? Because I wanted to make sure that our learners heard this today.
Yeah, it works in exactly the same way as an inoculation that you'd get, a flu shot or a COVID shot at your kind of medical center. You introduce a little piece of the vaccine, of the virus, in this instance, via a vaccine, that has been, essentially they've I'm struggling for the word here. They introduced a kind of a non-viral piece here, right?
They build resistance to it.
And it builds, the body reacts by building antibodies to this, okay? And the same can be true in a persuasive presentation. If you know you have an audience that's going to be skeptical about a particular claim you're going to make, if you know you have an audience that is going to be thinking, well, this might be a good product or a good service, but it's considerably more expensive. Rather than wait for your audience to raise those objections towards the end, the advice is bring up those weaknesses first. Present them first. And there are two things that will often result. So the first is you present the downside or this weakness on your terms. Let me say from the start, okay, I have a proposition today to present to you. I think it's a worthwhile one. I think it's worthy of your attention. I think it might be a really good opportunity for you. Let me also say that it's not going to be the cheapest option for you. But, here's the key. Here's the key. It's the word but. We've all had performance reviews where someone has said to us, oh, you did a great job last quarter, but, or that was a really good presentation, but, or I really like the way you did X, but. When we hear but, what do? We immediately dismiss everything that comes before it, and we focus our attention on the next thing. And that's how it works, the word but. It says, take everything that comes before, forget about that, place your attention on the next thing. And that is where you put your most compelling message. And it does two things. It raises the potential influence and credibility of the very next thing you're going to say. And it won't necessarily make that objection go away, but it puts it on your terms. And it signals that you are trustworthy. You are willing to point out that there may be a small downside, a weakness to your proposition, and that you haven't done what a lot of people do, which is kind of hide it in the small print or hope that no one ever notices it and it gets forgotten. It can be incredibly powerful. But notice, small, overcomable objections is if you're a drug company, I'm not advising you say, well, we've got this great new product. I mean, it's killed a few people, but I think we're going to work on that
Sure.
and answer. No, it's an overcomable objection, but
Yeah.
raising it first, it's counterintuitive. Why would you say something negative about your product in the early stages? But it can be an extraordinarily impactful thing to do.
And sometimes that goes back to knowing who your audience is and being able to say, however, let me show you how this price does pay dividends in the long run, or you have done your calculations to showcase this. Someone is asking, Geta is asking, do you have research supporting that consumers will be interested? Is there something when you're overcoming objections, before the objections come to you, do you find that an audience assumes that you've done your homework, assumes that you are focused on taking care of their questions versus going through your organizational flow?
I think so. And it's back to where we started at the beginning. It's back to that engaging, knowing your audience, engaging those rules of reciprocity. Look, I haven't come here today to deliver a canned presentation that I've kind of learned the script by heart and you're going to get it from start to finish.
Mm-hmm.
I'm tailoring my presentation to you. I'm thinking about, if I was in your position, what would I be saying? What would I be thinking? And I'm creating those contexts where my presentation is most likely to land favorably. That's exactly right.
Or you can say, I know you have 3 burning questions and I want to dive right in and answer those. So yeah. I'm sure, as you said, that your research covers some of that. I'd like to finish by transitioning to what we touched upon a little earlier, the type of messengers. And you talked a little bit about persuasion and influence having a different context when we take it outside of the North America, or maybe you can say Northern European, and we go to other parts of the world. And we as messengers have to adapt our style, and we also have to craft our message in a different way. There's an entire section in your book, which, by the way, one thing that I was impressed with, I counted 32 pages of references at the end. So it's well researched, I might say. What would be your advice in crafting and flexing your style as a messenger, or crafting your message around different parts of the world and cultures?
Yeah. Okay. So here's my advice. It's like a lot of things in life, and particularly in persuasive communication, it's what you do before you present your idea or start your proposition that matters most. Let me leave you with this, Tatiana. I like this research. It was done in the Citibank organization. And so first things first, okay, cross-cultural influence is incredibly complex. I need to state for the record that I know a little bit about it, but I wouldn't regard myself as an expert by any stretch. But I do follow it, and I have had a little bit of kind of experience working and looking at the research. Here's a piece of research that I really, really like, and it really does underline that point about it's what you do first. It was done in Citibank. It was done a few years ago. The reason they chose Citibank to do this research, Tatiana, was because Citibank at the time, or Citi as it's now known, had a policy where its senior managers, its exec teams, any from kind of like a vice president up, the policy was that at least 75% of that executive team was native to the country that it was operating in. So if you went to Citibank and it was in New York, it would be at least 75% North American. If you went to the UK and the London branch, it would be 75% British. If you went to Tokyo, it would be 75% Japanese, et cetera, et cetera. You get the point.
Sure.
And what the researchers did was they wanted to understand, under what circumstances would these executives be persuaded by a case that was made to them that they didn't necessarily have to say yes to? So they were needing to be persuaded. They weren't being required to do something, okay? And it actually required them to take some effort to support this idea. That was the context, Okay. Now, typically speaking, and I want to make this point importantly, the general rule, and it's general, okay, so this is not a whitewash, but generally speaking, what we find in the research is that the further north and west you go on the globe, the more individualistic cultures tend to be. The further east and south, the more collective.
Mm-hmm.
So in our cultures, we think more about what's in it for me.
Mm-hmm.
In collective cultures, people think what's in it for we.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so what we find is that, for example, when you're trying to persuade this board in North America, North and Western Europe, the question that came back the most was people were saying, well, what has this person that's making this presentation done for me previously? Am I obligated to help them? And so there, that principle of reciprocity rises.
Back to what we started talking about. Mm-hmm.
So the point there is that when persuading these groups, you want to be thinking about what can I do for this group first in preparation for them to be willing to listen to me. Okay.
Yeah.
If you go to Southeast Asia, though, that's a disastrous approach. In Southeast Asia, what they were saying is, am I required, because of the connections that this person has, particularly to other ranking officials in my organization, am I required to listen to them?
Mm-hmm.
And so there, your strategy should be, before you present, you make sure that you put time and effort in to connect to others that they're connected to and make those connections salient. I was speaking to this person, I was speaking to your colleague here, before you make your presentations.
Or even have them in the room to show
exactly
your
right.
support.
It's exactly right.
Absolutely.
In the Mediterranean cultures, South America, actually it was the liking principle. You know, is this person that's making this recommendation connected to one of my friends? So in that instance, you want to be saying things like, well, here's how I'm connected to your friend on a social basis. And in other cultures, so largely in the Scandinavian, Germanic, Central Eastern Europe, consistency principle was the most appropriate here. Here were people saying, well, am I required by the official rules and protocols of this organization to listen to this person? And so showing how your proposition is consistent with the values and the strategies and the protocols of the organization or the audience concerned can be helpful. But it comes back to that broader point that you made at the very beginning, Tatiana, is that knowing this means that we can adapt and structure our message. Our message essentially stays the same. As a messenger, we can adapt ourselves, but that cultural context can have some impact.
So important. And some of you are still asking questions. One is, how do we turn the me into we thinkers and control what you can? This question specific is, I say, if you have the self-awareness, you don't change anyone else, but you are the one that keeps this in mind so that you can be more effective and influential with your audience. It's more about what you can do. I don't think you can do anything to change unless you figure out what's in it for them, what will benefit them as a team or as an individual. Steve?
I think you're largely right about that. I mean, my response to how do we turn me thinkers into we thinkers is to do exactly what you did on me, Tatiana, is actually say, well, what is this? What do I know about this guy? What do I know about his identity? Well, he works in a business school. He works in the context of influence and persuasion. He works in persuasion. I do these things too. So, you know, what binds us together? You know, identities are crucial, are central to who we are, how we behave, and how we react to messages. And so the really smart persuader will be thinking about that and thinking, because oftentimes in an audience, you might have 5 people in an audience, you might have 500, 5,000 people in an audience.
Yeah.
What is it that you do that brings those audiences together? The charismatic speaker has this ability to communicate in metaphors and stories that everyone can kind of say yes to. So it's almost like you have to think superordinately in terms of not what's different about all these different people, but what can I say that they can all subscribe to and that is likely to engage them because they see it as part of their identity.
Yeah. Which brings us back to the beginning, which is being human and the human factor and being authentic and telling the stories from the perspective. And And if you are in a different part of the world, friends, you all know this from where all the parts of the world you come from, spending some time in that context to get a better understanding and not saying anything that would make you seem so different from others. So we've come to the end of our time together. We could go on for a whole other session. Steve, we'll have to have you back because there's so many questions on icebreakers and design and presentations, but that's when all this is put to the test. Some of you have asked for what are good courses or videos we're going to put up, and as soon as we finish class or the session, these links will be able to be trackable. But we will put a link to Steve's LinkedIn Learning course on the 10 essentials of influence of persuasion. That's where I locked in definitely with this. We gave you a link to the Messenger's specific site where you can do the quiz. And at the end, we'll put up a QR code where you can go directly to that. Now, Steve also is the CEO of Influence at Work, which is a behavioral science body of knowledge, which does help. I was amazed. You were talking in your previous executive education, there were 40 people from different companies wanting to find out how they can be more effective and influential through the research of behavioral science. And it applies to all of us, no matter what it is that we do. So Steve, thank you for your expertise and thank you for your time and for sharing all of this. This is recorded. Thanks to all of you from coming in to see us. Any parting words? Or maybe I always say, what's the one thing that our learners should do to put all of this into action?
Well, I've learned a lot in this session, and I think one thing that comes highly recommended, Tatiana, is to stay connected to you and this series of programs that you run. So I think that's a pretty good start. The LinkedIn Learning course, the 10 Essentials of Influence and Persuasion. I think we currently have about 50,000 people going through that. So it's popular, at least. So that might be something. And to your point, for those of you that are interested in, the broader application, influenceatwork.co.uk. There's lots of case studies there, how we're applying this, not just in business settings and in kind of broader communications and government settings, but also in things like climate change, conservation, these kind of things as well. I'm lucky to have an incredibly talented team that are leading on those work. But I think, a starting point would be to stay connected to you, Tatiana. I certainly am as well. I'm glad you reached out. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for participating. We'll see you next time. Take care, Steve, and thank you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.